Welcome to the podcast. This episode is going to be about George Washington. This is not intended to be a exhaustive technical history of everything about Washington. This is just a general overview of some things about Washington, kind of answering the question of why was he great? Why should we care about Washington? What did he do for the Republic? He was born in what was to become the United States. He inherited a slave plantation. So he was a British colonial. Okay, so he wasn't born in Britain and moved over to the Americas. He was born in the colonies of Britain. He was an ambitious young man. He got into the army. He wanted to be a big deal in the army. It's not like he was just, all this was thrust upon him. No, he wanted to be a great man. Sometimes people will hold that against him. I don't really know why. What's wrong with being ambitious as long as it's not for pure self-aggrandizement and you don't take advantage of other people. He wanted to be important. He wanted to do important things. He fought in the British Army as a colonial, a kind of attaché to one of the generals, because he knew the terrain and everything. Because he was a leader in the colonial militia before the French and Indian War. And then when the French and Indian War started, which he played some role in the beginnings of it, but then once it got going full swing, he was with a British general, kind of embedded in a major British army. There is a story in the French and Indian War where the British army is walking through this forest, kind of in a long line, and the French and the Indians come out and kind of bottle them up. So they can't really stack up horizontally like they do in a European style battle. There's not enough room. And as they're starting to try to form lines to fight, the Indians ambush them from the sides. And it's a rout. It's a huge debacle for the British Army. All of their leaders get horses shot out from under them. The general is shot. The army gets away, but it's a major defeat. And it's a cool story because Washington is the only leader who makes it out of there. All the other leaders are either wounded or killed. He had, I think the story goes, 3 horses shot out from under him. When he got home later, he examined his clothes and there were bullets in his hat and in his vest. Or at least in his clothes. And so that's how the story goes. It's a pretty cool story. So when the revolution gets going, he's kind of the obvious choice to be the commander-in-chief, and they pick him because this will help bring the South along. The revolution really starts up in the northern colonies, right? In Boston, the Sons of Liberty are agitating, kind of causing all the problems. And people in the South, and other colonies too, are kind of reticent to jump on board. But when they nominate Washington, it kind of shows, hey, this isn't just a Massachusetts thing. We want a Virginian to be at the head of this. And everyone knew he really was the guy with the most experience. There's another British guy, and I don't know a lot about him, but Gates comes along later and kind of resents the fact that Washington is in charge, and he kind of thinks he should be in charge, and he wins at the Battle of Saratoga much later. But right now, they pick Washington. So he spends basically the next 8 years, from 75, 76, until 83, 1775 until 1783, holding this army together. At first, it's straight ragtag militia, not very well organized, no money. And it doesn't get much better throughout the war. They do get more disciplined, they do get better, but the financing of the war the whole time is a huge headache for Washington. Multiple times he's encamped during the winter and he's barely holding his army together. Valley Forge is the most well-known episode or instance of that. And he has to do a lot to keep this army together. So it's a kind of a heroic effort that he does there. This is one of the things that convinces him and other army leaders who later get into government, some of them, that we need a strong central government because the states couldn't be forced to send money. Congress was powerless. Congress was kind of like the UN is today. It had more legitimacy, I think, than that, but it still couldn't force any states to pay. So a lot of them wouldn't. And it's kind of miraculous that the army even succeeded because they weren't well financed at all. So you got to give a lot of credit to Washington for holding that army together for so long. He was an excellent and inspiring general. His men followed him. A couple times he put himself in harm's way, kind of foolishly. It ended up working out. But they followed him because he realized, whoa, I better step in here and help and use my influence as the general to rally my guys. There are a couple episodes where he did really great things. Towards the beginning of the war, they had just lost New York. Everyone, including Washington, kind of thinks, yeah, we had a good run. I think the revolution's over. And then he goes into New Jersey and wins 2 battles, surprise battles. And within about 10 days, he turns everything around and revitalizes the spirit of the American army. People start to think, oh, maybe we can actually do this. And that's one of the things he should be remembered for. That's an excellent example of generaling. Now, if he was up against Napoleon or somebody of that caliber, yeah, he'd probably lose. And the British generals did make a lot of mistakes. One of the reasons that I've read, the British generals, at first especially, they didn't really want to just beat up the Americans. They wanted to beat them a couple times and then say, all right, guys, come on, come back to the empire. We don't want this to be too much. Kind of like American generals in the Civil War, U.S. generals in the Civil War. They didn't just want to beat them into the ground and into submission. They kind of thought, oh, they'll just give up. And so that allowed some breathing room for the revolution, and Washington took advantage of it. I think his greatest strength was that he was honest and dedicated to a republican form of government. He really believed that to his core. So then at the end of the war, when sometimes in revolutions the general just takes over either because he wants to or because that's the only thing that makes sense because everything's falling apart, he doesn't do that. And he almost lets everything fall apart. I mean, before the Constitution, there was a good chance that the country could fall apart. The Articles of Confederation didn't work. And so that was his real strength, his solidity, his dedication to popular government, and the fact that he thought, I'm not going to take over. That didn't even, I bet you that didn't even cross his mind. That was just antithetical to everything they had been fighting for. There's a story where the King of England is walking through the garden with one of his aides, and the aide says, there's talk that Washington might just give up power after the war. And the king, kind of scoffing, like in disbelief, says something like, if he does that, he'll be the best person in the world or best man in the world. And so when he actually did it, everyone was stunned. And that alone, Washington deserves a place in history for. That he didn't try to take over and just gave up power and went home. And that's why they compare him to Cincinnatus, this Roman general who might not even have been real, but there was this legend or this story in the founding of Rome that this general named Cincinnatus, during a crisis, They call him off of his farm and he comes for like 2 weeks or something like that, fixes everything, and then goes home and lets go of power. And so, he's kind of a Cincinnatus type figure. He was the only political figure that everybody trusted. And so after, you have the Treaty of Paris in 1783 when the war ends officially, and we get all the 13 colonies and what we now call the Midwest, basically over to the Mississippi River. Not all of the Midwest, of course, but over to the Mississippi. And then he just goes home and says, I'm done with public life. I'm going back to my plantation that has suffered during the war, and I'm done. I'm done with this. But the problem is the Articles of Confederation don't work. The states aren't united. They're not being governed well. And so he comes back at the Constitutional Convention. He comes back, and everybody, that gives the convention legitimacy. The fact that he's there, a lot of people think if they do have some kind of leader, then he'll be it. And they all trust him, so they're cool with that. And they give the president more powers than they probably otherwise would have because they knew Washington was going to get those powers. And so he's kind of the glue holding all this together. Everybody knows that if Washington's there, this thing will have some legitimacy and it might actually work. That's one of the main reasons people are allowed to let go of some of their jealousies or their hatreds for the other parts of the country and allow some concessions so that everybody can join the country. At the end of his life, I don't know I read this like once and I've heard it from other sources. I don't know technically all of it, but I know that he allowed some of his slaves to be freed, the ones that he was allowed to, because some of them, I guess, belonged to his wife and their family. And I know his aide, he had this slave who was his right-hand man, his aide throughout the war and basically throughout his life. And he, I don't know for sure if it was when he was president, but I know it was during the war. This guy was with him all the time. And he gives that guy sort of a pension for the rest of his life. So he changes his tune throughout the revolution. He and others start to realize we need to figure out how to get rid of slavery. And so that's a separate issue. But then you can go Google exactly how that all went down. But he wasn't one of those founders who just kept his slaves and didn't care about slavery. He did think it was a bad thing towards the end of the war. He is, I think, the kind of leader we need now. Honest, dedicated to Republican government, dedicated to our ideals, someone that everyone can actually trust to be above politics. I don't know who's out there who's like that right now. My guess is they're somewhere off in the private sector or they're just in local government somewhere, and they would be great, but they don't want to get embroiled in all this disgustingness that is modern American politics. It's disgusting. You get tarred with all these accusations and innuendos, and your family gets dragged through the mud, and who wants that? And this guy could have sat off to the side. He didn't have to run this army, but he sacrificed, and it ended up turning out good for him and for the country. I mean, if it had failed, he would have probably regretted that he did it. But a lot of the founders were like that, and they're dedicated patriots, and we need more like that. And that's one of the main reasons that I think we should study Washington and that we should understand how important he really was for the founding of this country. Thank you for listening.